The fall of justice. The autumn wind howled through the towering columns of the old courthouse, stirring the crisp scent of fallen leaves and damp stone. The heavy oak doors creaked as they swung shut behind Judge Theo Whitmore, sealing off the grand marble halls where he had spent decades presiding over cases that shaped countless lives. But today was different. Today, as he stepped onto the courthouse steps, he felt a weight in his chest, not just the ache of old age but something heavier, something that had settled deep within his soul over the years. He paused, gripping the railing, his weathered fingers tracing the cold iron. The sky overhead was thick with clouds, an ominous gray pressing down like the very weight of justice itself. He let out a slow breath, his exhale visible in the crisp October air. For 40 years, he had worn the black robe of authority. For 40 years, he had listened, judged, and sentenced men and women who stood trembling before him. Some had begged. Some had wept. Some had cursed his name. And some had simply stood silent. Guilty. Innocent. 25 years. Life without parole. Words he had spoken 1,000 times. Now, for the first time in his life, he wondered, how many times had he been wrong? He shook his head and dismissed the thought. Regret was a fool's game, and Judge Whitmore was no fool. He had done his duty. He had followed the law. He took his first step down. Then another. His polished shoes clicked against the worn stone, each footfall steady, measured, just as his judgments had been. But then, pain. A sharp, searing pain struck his chest like an iron fist. His breath hitched, his vision blurred, and a suffocating pressure spread through his ribcage. His fingers clawed at his coat as he staggered. His briefcase slipped from his grasp, tumbling down the steps. People on the sidewalk below froze. A well-dressed woman in a navy suit gasped, clutching her pearls. A young man in a business suit hesitated, pulling out his phone but not dialing. An older gentleman shook his head and muttered, "Poor bastard." No one moved. The world tilted as his knees buckled. The courthouse steps rushed up to meet him. Then, she appeared. Ava Carter had spent the last 8 hours on her feet, running orders, refilling coffee, and cleaning up after customers who barely acknowledged her existence. The diner had been packed, lunch rush spilling into the afternoon crowd, people laughing, arguing, scrolling mindlessly on their phones. No one had noticed the exhaustion etched into her face, the way she rolled her aching shoulders between orders. Now, her shift was finally over. Her sneakers slapped against the pavement as she hurried down the street, a plastic grocery bag cutting into her fingers. The cold wind whipped her ponytail across her cheek, and she sighed, shifting the bag to her other hand. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw something that made her stop in her tracks. A man, old, distinguished, his expensive coat flaring around him like a judge's robe, collapsed on the courthouse steps. She saw his briefcase spill open, papers scattering like fallen leaves. She saw the way his face twisted in agony, how his hands clutched desperately at his chest. And she saw everyone else, just watching. No one was moving. A spark of anger flared in her chest. Why was it always like this? Why did people freeze when someone was suffering? She ran. The ground was cold beneath her knees as she dropped beside the fallen man. His skin was pale, too pale. His eyes were half open, dazed, his breath coming in shallow gasps. "Sir," she said urgently, pressing 2 fingers to his wrist, feeling for a pulse. Weak. Unsteady. "Somebody call 911, she shouted. The businessman who had hesitated earlier finally snapped out of it, fumbling with his phone. Ava turned back to the judge. His breathing was ragged, his eyes flickering as though he were trying to speak. She placed a steady hand on his chest, feeling the rapid, uneven thumping of his heart. Hey, don't pass out on me," she murmured, leaning closer. "Stay awake." His lips moved. A whisper, so soft she almost missed it. "Hurts." "I know," she said, voice gentle but firm. "Help is coming." His fingers twitched, reaching for something, his briefcase, maybe? Ava glanced at it, the papers fluttering in the wind. Then she saw it. A name. Her breath hitched. Her father's name. Michael Carter. Ava's stomach twisted violently. The wind roared in her ears. She looked down at the man gasping beneath her hands. The man she had just saved. And realization slammed into her like a tidal wave. Judge Theodore Whitmore. The man who had sentenced her father to prison. Her hands trembled. For a second, just a second, she hesitated. The past came rushing back in sharp, painful fragments. Her father being dragged away in handcuffs. Her mother sobbing at the kitchen table. The whispered conversations about justice, or the lack of it. The countless appeals. The empty promises. The life that had been stolen from her family. And now, here he was. Weak. Vulnerable. Helpless. She could walk away. Let fate decide. Let him feel what it was like to be powerless, just like her father had felt when this man had sentenced him to 25 years for a crime he swore he hadn't committed. But Ava wasn't like him. She wasn't a judge. She wasn't someone who got to decide who lived or died, who was guilty or innocent. She was just a waitress with aching feet and a heart too big for her own good. So she stayed. She pressed down on his chest, whispering, "Breathe. Keep breathing." Because fate wasn't hers to decide. Not yet. But when he woke up, then she would make sure he understood exactly what he had done. And this time, she wouldn't be the one begging for justice. This time, she would demand it, awakening to the past. A sharp, rhythmic beeping pierced the silence. Theodore Whitmore stirred, his eyelids fluttering open, but the world remained a hazy blur. The scent of antiseptic filled his nostrils, mixing with the faint aroma of clean linen. A dull, persistent ache radiated from his chest, each shallow breath a reminder of his own mortality. He was alive. Slowly, his vision sharpened. The sterile white ceiling above him was unfamiliar, but the mechanical hum of medical equipment and the 4-needle taped to his arm confirmed what he already suspected. A hospital. His throat was dry, his body weak, but as his senses returned, so did his thoughts. The courthouse steps. The pain. The fall. And then, her. The young woman. Her face flickered in his memory, dark eyes, determined yet kind, a voice both urgent and steady. She had been the last thing he saw before the world went black. He shifted slightly, wincing as soreness spread through his chest. A heart attack. He should have expected it. The years of stress, the long hours, the lonely nights filled with regret he never dared voice out loud. His body had finally forced him to stop, even if his mind had never been willing to. A rustling sound to his left drew his attention. He turned his head slowly, expecting to see a nurse or a doctor. Instead, he found her. The young woman sat in the chair beside his bed, arms crossed, expression unreadable. She was dressed simply, a gray hoodie, jeans, sneakers that looked well worn. Strands of hair had slipped from her ponytail, framing a face that seemed both familiar and foreign at the same time. He opened his mouth to speak, but his throat was too dry. She moved before he could even ask, reaching for the small plastic cup on the bedside table and pressing the straw to his lips. He sipped. The cool water soothed his throat, and after a moment, he managed a hoarse, "Thank you." She set the cup down. "You don't have to thank me." There was something in her voice. Something sharp beneath the softness. Something that sent a prickle of unease down his spine. He swallowed, his voice still weak. You were there. At the courthouse. She nodded but said nothing. For a long moment, silence stretched between them. Then, finally, she leaned forward, elbows resting on her knees. Her dark eyes locked onto his, unblinking. And then. You sentenced my father to prison for a crime he didn't commit. The words sliced through the air like a blade. Whitmore's breath caught. For a moment, he thought he had misheard. But the steady fire in her gaze told him otherwise. She wasn't here out of gratitude. She was here for justice. A sick, sinking feeling settled in his gut. His pulse quickened. Not from fear, not from anger, but from something far worse. Recognition. Slowly, carefully, he whispered, "Who was your father?" Her jaw tightened. Michael Carter. The name sent a shockwave through his system. Michael Carter. 25 years. Armed robbery. A conviction he had handed down over a decade ago. His mind reeled back, searching, grasping for details buried beneath thousands of cases, thousands of verdicts. He remembered. The trial had been swift. Carter had been accused of robbing a liquor store at gunpoint, though no weapon was ever found. A security tape showed a figure in a hoodie, a man of Carter's height, Carter's build. Witnesses had testified. A jury had deliberated. And he, Judge Whitmore, had sentenced him. 25 years. He remembered Carter's face when the verdict was read. How his eyes had darkened, not with anger, not with desperation, but with something far worse. Hopelessness. It had been just another case to him. Another name in a file. Another judgment passed. But to the girl sitting beside him, it had been everything. His throat tightened. He tried to speak, but the words refused to come. "I saved your life," she said, her voice controlled, but her fingers were clenched together so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. "I didn't even know who you were when I ran to help. I didn't know I was saving the man who stole my father's life." A cold weight settled in his chest, heavier than the pain from his heart attack. He had lived a long life, but never had he felt so powerless. She exhaled, steadying herself. "But now that you're alive, you're going to fix it." He blinked, dazed. "Fix? You're going to prove that my father is innocent," she said, her voice unwavering. "Because he is. And deep down, you already know it." His breath was uneven. I don't have that power anymore. I retired." Her expression didn't change. "Then unretire." "I can't." "Yes, you can." She leaned in, and for the first time, he saw the raw emotion beneath her controlled exterior. "Do you know what it's like to lose a father?" she asked quietly. "To see your mother break a little more every day? To grow up knowing that no matter what you do, no matter how hard you work, people will always look at you as the daughter of a convicted criminal?" He had no answer. Her voice hardened. "I didn't think so." The silence between them was deafening. Ava stood. "You owe me," she said, gripping the strap of her bag. "You owe him. You spent your life deciding other people's fates, now it's time you fix the one you got wrong." She turned to leave. But before she could reach the door, his voice stopped her. "I don't even know where to begin." She turned back, her expression unreadable. "Yes, you do." Then, without another word, she walked out of the hospital room, leaving Judge Whitmore alone with the weight of his past. And for the first time in his life, he truly questioned everything he had ever believed about justice. The weight of justice. The hospital room fell into silence as the door clicked shut behind her. Judge Theodore Whitmore sat motionless, the weight of Ava Carter's words pressing down on him like a mountain. For years, he had lived under the illusion that his judgments had been fair, that his courtroom had been a place of justice, not destruction. But now, the past he had neatly tucked away was unraveling in front of him. And the worst part? He couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling in his gut telling him she was right. He had sentenced thousands of people in his time. Cases blurred together, files, testimonies, closing arguments, all part of the machine of justice. But Michael Carter. That name wouldn't leave him now. Even though his body still ached from the heart attack, a different kind of pain consumed him now, the pain of doubt. He needed answers. He had spent decades teaching young attorneys that a judge's work ended the moment the gavel fell, that justice wasn't personal. But maybe that was a lie he had told himself to sleep at night. And maybe this time, the work was just beginning. A night of reckoning. Hours passed. Nurses came and went, adjusting his monitors, checking his offering him food he had no appetite for. But his mind was elsewhere. When the night nurse dimmed the lights, he reached for his phone with a trembling hand. His fingers hesitated over the screen before typing in a familiar name. Detective Marcus Holloway. A man he had known for over 20 years. A man who had testified in hundreds of cases before him. A man who had been the lead investigator on Michael Carter's case. His thumb hovered over the call button. Was this the right thing to do? Would he find himself unraveling something he wasn't ready to face? He pressed call. The line rang once. Twice. Then a groggy voice answered. Do you have any idea what time it is? Whitmore exhaled slowly. Marcus, it's Theo. A pause. Theo? Jesus, man. Heard about what happened. You doing okay? I'm alive, he said, voice heavy. But I need your help. Another pause. The grogginess faded from the detective's voice. What's going on? Whitmore clenched the phone tighter. I need you to pull a case file for me, he said. Michael Carter. Silence. Then, Marcus sighed. That was, what? 12 years ago? 13. You never ask about old cases. What's this about? Whitmore glanced toward the door, as if expecting Ava to return at any moment. A woman saved my life today, he admitted. And she told me I ruined hers. Another long silence. Then Marcus let out a slow whistle. That's heavy. It gets worse. Whitmore swallowed. She's Michael Carter's daughter. A curse on the other end. Then, you think we got it wrong? I don't know. Marcus was quiet for a long time. Then, finally, he said, all right. Give me a few days. I'll see what I can find. Whitmore closed his eyes. Thank you. As he hung up, exhaustion pressed down on him. But he knew sleep wouldn't come easily tonight. Not when the ghosts of his past had just walked back into his life. The man behind the verdict. The next day, Whitmore was discharged from the hospital. The world outside was different. It wasn't that the city had changed, he had. The courthouse, the streets, the people, it all felt colder now. He went home to his quiet house. The walls, lined with law books and framed degrees, now felt like a prison. He spent the rest of the day doing something he hadn't done in years. He went through his own records. Old case files. Handwritten notes. Court transcripts. And then, finally, Michael Carter's case. The words on the pages were cold and clinical, but between the lines, he saw something he hadn't seen before. Doubt. The prosecution's case had been circumstantial. No weapon was ever found. The security footage was grainy. And the key witness, the store clerk, had changed his statement multiple times. Whitmore's breath was shallow as he stared at the papers in front of him. How had he not seen this before? How had he allowed himself to be so blind? He rubbed his temples. Because you trusted the system. Because he believed the police wouldn't bring forth a case unless they were certain. Because he had faith in a system that, deep down, wasn't built to protect everyone equally. And now, a man had spent 13 years behind bars for a crime he may not have committed. His stomach churned. He needed to talk to someone who could tell him the truth. And there was only one person who could. A father lost to time. 2 days later, he found himself standing outside Brookwood Correctional Facility. His heart pounded as he walked through the metal detectors, past the cold steel doors, past the tired faces of inmates who had long lost hope. A guard led him through a series of corridors before stopping at a small meeting room with a single table. "Wait here," the guard said. Minutes stretched into eternity. Then, finally, the door opened. And Michael Carter walked in. The man before him was not the man he remembered from the courtroom. 13 years had stolen the light from his eyes. His hair was graying at the temples, his shoulders slightly hunched. There was a quiet dignity in the way he carried himself, but his face was lined with the kind of suffering only the innocent knew. He sat across from Whitmore, his dark eyes unreadable. Neither spoke for a long moment. Then, Carter leaned back. "I never thought I'd see you again." Whitmore swallowed. "Neither did I." Silence. "Then, your daughter saved my life." Something flickered in Carter's gaze, pain, pride, sorrow. "She told me." His voice was calm, but there was a sharp edge beneath it. "She's a good kid. Smarter than I ever was. Stronger, too." Whitmore nodded slowly. Carter's voice darkened. "What do you want, Judge?" Whitmore exhaled. "I want the truth," he admitted. Carter's eyes bore into him. "You had the truth," he said quietly. "You just didn't listen." Those words hit harder than Whitmore expected. "I need to make this right," he said, his voice hoarse. "I don't know how yet, but I will." Carter studied him for a long moment. Then, finally, he gave a tired smile. "You want the truth," he said. "Then you're going to have to fight for it." Whitmore nodded. And for the first time in his life, he knew that justice wasn't just about the law, it was about the truth. And sometimes, the truth came decades too late. The cost of redemption. The drive back from Brookwood Correctional Facility was a blur of streetlights and memories. Judge Theodore Whitmore gripped the steering wheel, his mind trapped in a whirlwind of guilt and realization. Michael Carter had been right. The truth had been there all along, buried beneath rushed testimonies, sloppy police work, and a system designed to convict rather than protect. And Whitmore had been a part of it. The weight of it all pressed down on him like an unbearable storm. For decades, he had prided himself on being a man of justice. But now, for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure if he even knew what justice truly was. The walls of doubt. By the time he pulled into his driveway, the sky had turned the color of burning embers, the sun dipping below the city skyline. His house, once a place of comfort, felt foreign. He stepped inside, the silence almost deafening. Framed photographs of his legal career lined the walls, his graduation from law school, his first day as a judge, newspaper clippings that called him a pillar of justice. It all felt hollow now. Whitmore made his way to his study, his hands shaking as he unlocked his desk drawer. Inside lay a thick folder, his personal notes from Michael Carter's trial. For the first time in 13 years, he read them not as a judge, but as a man searching for the truth. And what he found made his stomach turn. The lead detective, Marcus Holloway, had pushed for a quick conviction. The witness testimony had been altered multiple times before trial. Carter's alibi had been dismissed too easily. Whitmore leaned back in his chair, his breath shallow. This wasn't just an unfortunate mistake. It was something far worse. Michael Carter had been set up. And Whitmore had helped put him away. A sharp knock at the door shattered his thoughts. He turned, his heart pounding. He wasn't expecting anyone. When he opened the door, Ava Carter stood there. Her eyes, filled with fire and determination, locked onto his. "I hope you're ready," she said. "Ready for what?" he asked, though deep down, he already knew the answer. Ava's expression hardened. To tear the system apart. A deal with the devil. Whitmore sat across from Ava in his study, the room thick with tension. "So?" she pressed. "Did you find anything?" He exhaled. "I found enough to know your father was wrongfully convicted." Ava's jaw tightened. "Then let's get him out." Whitmore hesitated. "I can't just snap my fingers and undo everything," he admitted. "The legal system doesn't work that way." Ava narrowed her eyes. "Funny. It worked that fast when you put him away." Her words cut deeper than she probably intended. Whitmore rubbed his temples. "We need a plan." Ava folded her arms. "Then make one." He leaned forward. "There's only one way to get your father exonerated," he said. "We need new evidence." Ava scoffed. The evidence was never the problem. Corrupt cops and lazy judges were. Whitmore swallowed the insult, because he knew it was true. "I need to talk to Marcus Holloway," he said. Ava's expression darkened. "The detective?" He nodded. "He was lead investigator on your father's case," Whitmore explained. "If there was any corruption, he was close enough to know about it." Ava studied him for a long moment. Then, finally, she said, "So what's the plan?" Whitmore hesitated. Because the plan he was about to suggest could cost them everything. Unraveling the truth. 2 days later, Whitmore sat in a dimly lit bar, waiting. He had called Marcus Holloway under the pretense of discussing an old case. And if he knew Holloway, the detective would never turn down a conversation about past victories. Sure enough, the door swung open, and Holloway strolled in. Age had worn him down, a few more gray hairs, deeper lines around his eyes, but his posture was still confident, his presence still commanding. He spotted Whitmore and smirked. Well, he said, sliding into the seat across from him. "Didn't think I'd be seeing you again so soon." Whitmore offered a tight smile. "Thanks for coming." Holloway signaled to the bartender for a drink. "So, what's this about?" Whitmore hesitated, then leaned in. "Michael Carter's case," he said. Holloway's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes shifted. "What about it?" Whitmore kept his voice steady. "I think we got it wrong." Holloway let out a low chuckle. "That was over a decade ago, Theo. We did what we had to do." Whitmore felt his pulse quicken. "Did we?" Holloway took a slow sip of his drink. Then, in a quieter voice, he said, "You're not the first person to ask about that case." Whitmore tensed. "Who else?" Holloway swirled his glass. "Someone's been poking around," he admitted. "Some young reporter. Says she found inconsistencies." Whitmore's stomach twisted. "Did you talk to her?" Holloway's smirk returned. "Nope." He leaned forward. "Because I don't deal with ghosts." Whitmore's blood turned cold. A reporter had been investigating Michael Carter's case. And now she was missing. Holloway drained his drink and stood. "Let it go, Theo," he said. "You're too old to start playing hero." With that, he walked away, leaving Whitmore drowning in a realization far darker than before. This wasn't just a mistake. This was a cover-up. And if they weren't careful, Ava and Whitmore might be next. A dangerous truth. The revelation hit Theodore Whitmore like a fist to the gut. Someone had been investigating Michael Carter's case. And now, they were gone. His hands trembled slightly as he left the bar, his thoughts tangled in a web of suspicion and fear. This wasn't just about one wrongful conviction. Someone had ensured that the truth remained buried. And if Whitmore and Ava kept digging, they might disappear next. Shadows of the past. Whitmore barely slept that night. By morning, he knew what he had to do. He needed to find out who this missing reporter was. He pulled out his laptop and searched for any recent articles about Michael Carter's case. Nothing. No names. No leads. Just silence. But silence could be just as loud as evidence. After a long search, he found one article. It wasn't much, just a brief mention of Michael Carter in an independent news blog. But at the bottom of the page was a name. Madison Clark. A small-time journalist who had a reputation for exposing corruption. Whitmore immediately dialed the number listed on the site. It rang. Once. Twice. Then. The number you are trying to reach is no longer in service. A chill ran down his spine. He checked her social media. Her last post was from 3 months ago. Then, nothing. She had vanished. Whitmore sat back, his mind racing. Had she uncovered the same things he and Ava were beginning to see? And if so, who had silenced her? The warning. Whitmore called Ava. "We need to meet," he said. Now. An hour later, they sat in a quiet cafe on the outskirts of town. Ava listened as he told her about Madison Clark. "She found something," Ava murmured. "Something big." Whitmore nodded. "And now she's gone." Ava's jaw tightened. "So what do we do?" Whitmore hesitated. This was dangerous. They weren't just fighting an unjust system anymore. They were up against something much worse. Corruption. Cover-ups. People willing to do anything to keep the truth buried. He took a deep breath. "We don't stop," he said. Ava studied him, her eyes sharp. "Then let's make them nervous." The unseen threat. That night, Whitmore returned home, feeling uneasy. He checked the locks. Pulled the curtains shut. Something about Holloway's words haunted him. "You're too old to start playing hero." It felt like a warning. Or a threat. A noise outside made him freeze. A rustling. A shadow near his front porch. Heart pounding, he grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside. Nothing. Just the wind. Then. A piece of paper, taped to his door. He pulled it off and unfolded it. 4 words. "Stop digging or else." Whitmore's blood ran cold. Someone was watching them. Someone wanted them to stop. But it was too late for that now. If anything, this only made him more determined. Because now, he knew one thing for certain. They were closer to the truth than ever before. The price of justice. The weight of the note pressed against Theodore Whitmore's chest like a heavy stone. Stop digging or else. It was a warning. A threat. And a confirmation that they were onto something someone desperately wanted to keep buried. Whitmore had spent years sentencing criminals, sending men and women to prison, believing he was upholding justice. Now, he knew better. Justice wasn't blind. It was controlled. Manipulated. Bought and sold like a cheap commodity. And the system he had once trusted? It had blood on its hands. No turning back. Whitmore locked the front door, his hands trembling slightly as he bolted it shut. He wasn't afraid of the dark. But he was afraid of the monsters hiding in it. His first instinct was to call Ava, to warn her. But as he reached for his phone, another thought struck him. Was she already being watched? If she was in danger, calling her might only make things worse. Instead, he sent a single text. "We need to meet. Urgent." The reply came almost instantly. "Where?" Whitmore thought for a moment before typing. "Somewhere safe. I'll find you." Then, with a deep breath, he grabbed his coat and stepped out into the night. Whoever was behind this wanted him to be afraid. And he was. But fear wouldn't stop him. Not now. Ava's revelation. An hour later, Whitmore met Ava at a 24-hour diner on the far side of town. The place smelled of burnt coffee and grease, the flickering neon sign outside casting eerie shadows against the windows. Ava sat in the back booth, her hood pulled up, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee. She looked up as Whitmore slid into the seat across from her. Her eyes were sharp. Determined. "We're in trouble," she said quietly. Whitmore exhaled. "I know." Ava glanced around before pulling something from her bag, a thin stack of documents, yellowed with age. "I broke into my dad's old storage unit," she whispered. "I found this." Whitmore hesitated before taking the papers. The words hit him like a punch to the gut. A sworn affidavit. A confession. A witness had come forward years ago, claiming that Michael Carter had been framed. But the testimony had never seen the light of day. It had been buried. Ignored. Because someone in power, had made sure Michael Carter rotted in prison for a crime he never committed. And now, Whitmore knew who. The puppet master. There, at the bottom of the affidavit, was a name. Judge Richard Holloway. Whitmore's old friend. His mentor. The man who had warned him to stop digging. Everything clicked into place. Michael Carter had been framed. Holloway had signed off on it. And now, he was trying to cover his tracks. Whitmore felt sick. "I trusted him," he muttered. Ava's hands curled into fists. "He destroyed my father's life. He let my mother die alone. He stole everything from us." Whitmore clenched his jaw. "And we're going to make sure he pays for it." The confrontation. The next morning, Whitmore drove straight to Holloway's estate. The house was a fortress, gates, security cameras, everything a man with secrets would need. But Whitmore wasn't here to play it safe. He was here to end this. The butler barely had time to protest before Whitmore stormed past him, marching into the grand study where Holloway sat sipping his morning coffee. The old judge looked up, startled. "Theodore," he said smoothly. "What a surprise." Whitmore slammed the affidavit onto the desk. Holloway's face paled. "I know what you did," Whitmore said coldly. "You framed an innocent man. And you made sure the truth was buried." Holloway's fingers tightened around his cup. "You don't understand," he said quietly. "It wasn't my decision." Whitmore's stomach twisted. "Then whose was it?" Holloway's lips thinned. "There are people in this system far more powerful than you or me," he said. Michael Carter was a loose end. The case was political. A scapegoat was needed. Whitmore's hands balled into fists. "You sent an innocent man to prison for 30 years. Holloway's eyes darkened. "I did what I was told." Whitmore shook his head. "Not this time." He reached into his coat and pulled out his phone, revealing the recording app running the entire conversation. Holloway's expression shattered. Whitmore's voice was ice. "You're going to confess, Richard. You're going to make this right." Holloway's jaw clenched. And then, a gunshot rang through the room. The final choice. Whitmore gasped as a sharp pain exploded in his shoulder. He staggered back, gripping the wound. Holloway stood, gun in hand, his face grim. "You were always a good man, Theodore," he murmured. "But you should have walked away. Blood dripped from Whitmore's fingers. But he wasn't done yet. With one last surge of strength, he lunged forward. And slammed into Holloway, sending them both crashing into the desk. The gun clattered to the ground. Whitmore groaned in pain but reached for his phone, pressing send. The recording was sent straight to Ava. He heard footsteps, security, rushing in. Holloway's voice was distant, but laced with panic. "Take care of him." Whitmore's vision blurred. Then. Darkness. Justice at last. When Whitmore woke, he was in a hospital bed. Ava was there. So was a federal investigator. "It's over," Ava whispered. Whitmore's head pounded, but relief flooded through him. Holloway had been arrested. Michael Carter's case was being reopened. And the corruption that had poisoned the justice system was finally exposed. Ava looked at him, eyes filled with gratitude. "You did it," she said. Whitmore shook his head. "No," he murmured. "We did." And for the first time in years, he felt truly free.